Good morning, everybody. So a few weeks ago, the 20th season of American Idol began. And if you don't know the show, it's a show where a nervous contestant stands in front of three judges hoping to hear the words, "You're going to Hollywood. You're going to Hollywood." Now, though the show is 2 decades old, it is still the top-rated reality TV program. The initial edition of this 20th anniversary season had over 6 million viewers. And the show's format, though it's identical in every country, has been seen in 150 countries by, get this, more than 3 billion with a B people. That's about 40% of the planet's population. And no matter the country, the format is the same. There's a contestant who wants to advance and have a big break in their life, and a panel of judges who are going to determine who gets sent home crying and who makes it to the next level. Now, today, we're beginning week 12 in this deep dive series. I've been here 25 years, and starting next week will be the longest sermon series we've ever done at Grace Church. All right. So we've been studying the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark is very simply the story of Jesus told from Mark's perspective. It's a reality telling of his life. It's a biography of his life and his ministry. And week after week, we've been trying to share with you what we believe Mark is trying to share with us, which is what is the true identity of who Jesus is. As a matter of fact, you could make kind of the big idea for this whole series this really simple statement: that Jesus is a different kind of king with a different kind of kingdom who invites us to be different kinds of followers. This has been the intent that Mark wants us to get. And today we're going to look at a very interesting part of Jesus' identity. Today we're going to consider Jesus as a judge. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of judge is he? Is he much like the hated and much maligned Simon Cowell? Give me some boos and hiss. Boo, yeah. You know how Simon Cowell is. For you non-watchers, he's the mean, grumpy judge who loves to insult innocent singers and nervous contestants. Or is he like Pastor Wes's favorite judge? Yep, Steven Tyler. Yep. Lead singer from Aerosmith. Oh, Pastor Wes and I used to fight about Steven Tyler and Aerosmith on the church youth group bus, but that's another session with our therapist together. He replaced Simon Cowell after 10 years, and he got in trouble because he never had a bad thought about any contestant, especially if they were singing an Aerosmith song. So we have to ask ourselves the question, is Jesus a harsh judge like Simon Cowell, or is he a lenient judge like Steven Tyler? What kind of judge is Jesus? So let's be honest. When the pastor starts talking about judge and judgment, it's ripe for all kinds of theological, biblical debates, controversy, and let's be honest, even fear. And some of my colleagues who are on TV don't help us with all of their charts and their declarations. As a matter of fact, our own teaching team from all of the campuses at Grace Church spent literally hours in passionate discussion about this very message. Some of us wanted to throw up our arms and say, "I'm doomed," because we have this picture of Jesus in our mind as judge. And it's this Jesus who's kind of sitting behind the desk with a frown on his face and his arms crossed, and he's judging us, and we're longing to hear, "You're going to heaven." And yet we fear maybe he's going to say, "You're going straight to HE double hockey sticks," right? I'm even afraid to say that word in church, afraid that I might go there, right? The bottom line is that we fear judgment. So I want to say 2 things before we look at the text. First thing is relax. First thing I want you to know is relax. This is week 12. This is not week 1 of the sermon series. This is week 12 of the sermon series about the identity of Jesus. Don't forget everything you've learned in the last 11 weeks. If you missed any, go online. They're there. We've learned in the last 11 weeks that Jesus is a forgiver who hung out with notorious sinners just like you and me. That he's a healer who cast out demons and healed broken bodies. That he's a teacher who came to announce that the good news is not just for the religious elite, but it is for absolutely everybody. Jesus is the one who gave purpose and mission and destiny to lowly fishermen. He lifted up people who were on the margins. We learned last week, women and children, the poor, the diseased, the people that nobody else wants or sees. So don't forget that when we talk about Jesus as a judge, that he's also these other things. Number 2, be honest. Be honest with yourself. Because the reality is that you are surrounded by judges. Maybe you don't call them that, but think about it. Your bosses review you. Your customers survey you. Your supervisors, they manage you. Your teachers, they grade you. Your coaches, they evaluate you. My Weight Watchers app judges me. I'm having a disagreement with him right now. And then all of us have this longing and this yearning for the approval of others so bad that we enthrone them as the judges of our life. Our spouse, our kids, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, our parents, our coworkers, we let them become our ultimate judge. And then some of us, we let the culture become our judge. We let the culture tell us what it means to be smart, what it means to be thin, what it means to be beautiful. And so we let the culture become our judge. And then, worst of all of us in this room, every person watching online, I know this to be true of all of us. We all have a little judge that lives right here, isn't that true? And this judge speaks condemning words to us, telling us we'll never measure up. I know his voice. This judge loves to say to me, you shoulda, you coulda, you woulda. This judge is self-condemning. I become my own worst judge. So let's be honest. We got judges in our life already. So here's what we're going to learn today. Here's what we're going to learn today, and it's not a shocker. It's on the screen. Would you say this with me? Jesus is a different kind of judge. Say it again. Jesus is a different kind of judge. This comes as no surprise to us because Mark has challenged us all along that Jesus is a different kind of Messiah, different kind of king, different kind of teacher, and today a different kind of judge. Now again, I'm going to ask for lots of grace. Because we're going to look at a lot of material today. We're going to pick up in Mark 11. We're going to go all the way through Mark 12. And I need you to think the big picture. And so where we are today, Jesus is on his way towards Jerusalem. He's on his way into Jerusalem for the very last time. In 2 weeks, we're going to backtrack on Palm Sunday and look at that journey into Jerusalem for the last time. But today, Jesus and his 12 companions, his disciples, are leaving Bethany about 2 miles away or so from Jerusalem. They're walking into Jerusalem and they see a fig tree. And they see this fig tree and Jesus does this odd thing. He sees that this fig tree is healthy on the outside, has beautiful leaves, but it's bearing no fruit. And so Jesus curses the fig tree because it looks good on the outside, but it's not producing what it was made for. Now remember, 3 times a year, Jewish men had to go to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices during the big festivals. This was the festival of Passover. So Jesus is making his way into Jerusalem to the temple to bring his offerings. He sees a fig tree and he curses it. Remember that the temple is the very place that God promised, I will meet you here. So this was an important place. And when he arrives at the temple, Jesus sees that something is terribly wrong. That just like the fig tree, the temple, the place of worship, was beautiful on the outside, but it was not producing the fruit for which it was made. And Jesus ain't happy. He ain't happy. And he becomes the judge. And why? Well, there's 2 big problems. First is that it had become a marketplace. The high priest Caiaphas had set up a marketplace, a flea market, if you will, in a courtyard that was meant for the Gentiles. The word Gentiles means not a Jew. It was for the people of the other nations to come, a place of grace for them to worship. And they would set up this marketplace run by the high priests where they would charge way too much money for turtle doves and lambs to be offered in sacrifice because they couldn't bring it from their homes. So they would jack up the prices. You know when you go to a concert or to a baseball game and you pay $8 for a Coke? You know that feeling? Okay, that's kind of get that in your mind. The other thing they would do is they would exchange money, and the exchange rates were exorbitant. So this place that was supposed to be a place of worship for people who were not Jewish had become an exploitive flea market. And Jesus was angry. The second problem, a little more subtle in this story, is that there was a group of Jewish leaders known as zealots. They were revolutionary men, and they wanted to overthrow the Romans. And they had set up in the temple this kind of place for their zealot ways. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that by 66 AD, some 30 years after this story, these zealots actually killed their own priests. And that by 70 AD, they went to war with Rome, and Rome tore the temple down to its foundation. Jesus would predict this. So Jesus sees these two things about the temple, that it had become an exploitive flea market and a headquarter for violent overthrow, and he puts everybody on notice. Jesus is angry, but it's a different kind of anger. Because my anger tends to be about me. It's a self-seeking agenda, but not for Jesus. Jesus was motivated out of holy love, first for God and secondly for people. And out of this motivation, it says that Jesus, like Paul said in Ephesians 4:26, be angry yet do not sin. Jesus began to put the merchants and the marauders on notice. And you know what he does next, right? He overthrows the tables and the chairs. He's saying by this act that money and military might were not his kingdom. They haven't been then they aren't now. And Jesus is judging here. Don't try to soften it. Here's what Jesus says. Look at Mark 11, verse 17. He said to them, the scriptures declare, my temple will be called a what? A house of prayer for all nations. Yeah, for all nations. But you've turned it into a den of thieves. See, the temple was just like that fig tree. It looked good on the outside, but it did not produce the fruit for which it was made. And ironically, the very judges of the day, the religious leaders of the day, they're the ones that are complicit in it. They're making money, and they're aligning themselves with military power. Wealth and weapons is what they wanted. And Jesus reminds them that God's dream, that his desire for his people and for this temple was that it would be a house of prayer for everybody, for all the nations. And of course, they were happy about this, right? These religious leaders. Starts a chain reaction. Look at verse 18. When the leading priests and teachers of the law heard what Jesus had done, they repented, fell to their... No, that's not what it says. It says they began planning on how to what? How to kill him, yeah. But they were afraid of him because the people were so amazed at his teaching. They planned to kill Jesus, as best I can tell. This is the first time. I mean, before they're trying to test him, they're trying to trap him, but here they're trying to kill him. And so a day or so later, we're not told exactly when, Jesus and his disciples are in Jerusalem. And the religious leaders, they come to him with a question. Look at verse 28, Mark 11. They demanded, the religious leaders, by what? What's the word there? Authority. By what authority are you doing all of these things? Who gave you the right to do them? They're basically asking the question, Jesus, who made you the judge of me? Who made you my judge? And Jesus refuses to answer them. Instead, he does what Jesus so often did. He tells a story. Let me give you the summary of it. It talks about a man who went to plant a vineyard, and he built a wall and a tower to protect it. He built a pit for them to press the grapes. And then he leased it out to some tenant farmers. And then he went on a trip. Harvest time came, and it was time for him to get his fair share, his rent, if you will. He sends his servants. They beat up the servant and send him back to the master. He sends another and another and another, and they beat them all up and send him back to the master, to the owner. And then finally, the owner says, I will send my son whom I love. It's an important phrase. And he sends his son. And the tenant farmers think to themselves, now's our chance. We'll kill him and we'll take the farm. And so they kill him. And then Jesus asks a question. Look at verse 9. What do you suppose the owner of the vineyard will do? Jesus asked. I tell you, he will come and kill those farmers and lease the vineyard to others. Now, I want a happily ever after ending here. But Jesus gets to the point. He says, listen, I'm going to come after you and I'm going to destroy you. Because, you see, Jesus was pointing out that these farmers were these religious leaders. And that they were the ones who themselves would condemn Jesus. Now, don't soft sell this, friends. Jesus is judging here. And they know it. So the religious leaders, right? They're going to do the right thing, right? They're going to turn and repent and do the right thing. But look at verse 12. The religious leaders wanted to arrest Jesus because they realized he was telling the story against them. And they were the wicked farmers. But they were afraid of the crowd. So they left him and went their way. They would have taken Simon Cowell as their judge any day at this moment, right? But instead, Jesus is naming names. Jesus is judging their thoughts and their intentions of the religious leaders. And it doesn't end here. This thing of Jesus' judgment continues on in Mark chapter 12. These religious leaders, they collude together and they send different groups to Jesus to basically say, who are you to judge us? They asked Jesus to make what I want to call this morning judicial rulings. 3 different groups of religious leaders who come to see Jesus in Mark's gospel. First is Pharisees. They try to trap Jesus with a question about paying taxes to Caesar in Rome. A lot of us use these Bible verses as we get closer to April 15th. And Jesus judges their motives, and he avoids their trap by saying, give me a coin. And he says, whose face is on it? And they say, well, Caesar's face is on it. And so he says, give to Caesar what is his, and to God what is God's. Now listen to me, friends. I know a lot of us want to make this teaching of Jesus here about paying taxes and the separation of church and state, but you're missing the bigger point. You see, on this Roman coin was the face of a man who called himself a god. And Jesus was saying, just give it to him, because that's what he thinks of himself. What was Jesus' point? He says, give to God that which is God's. What's imprinted on every human heart is the image, not of a Roman Caesar, but the image of God. And Jesus' point in all of this is not about paying taxes. He's saying, give yourself completely to God. The Pharisees couldn't trap him. And then the Sadducees, they would be more like the progressive liberal group. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They were the second group that comes, and they bring this complex riddle, a kind of hypothetical woman who had 7 husbands, and she loses all 7 husbands to death. The Jewish law required that a brother would have to marry his brother's widow, and so this hypothetical woman marries 7 men, and all 7 of them die. Who wants to marry this woman, right? But then they asked Jesus. They asked Jesus this question. Which of the 7 brothers is she married to in heaven? And Jesus turns up the temperature and he judges them. And he says, you don't even understand what the Bible says. That's kind of bad for a preacher to be told they don't understand the Bible. And then worse yet, Jesus judges their lack of belief in the power of God. and the Sadducees, they fail the test. Now, the third guy that comes to Jesus is a little more honorable. And most of us can relate to this third guy. Because this third guy comes to Jesus. He's a religious guy. He comes to Jesus. He's a church-going guy. And he says, Jesus, which is the most important commandment of God? And Jesus tells him, look at verses 29 through 31. Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this. Listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. And you must what? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. See, this guy who comes to Jesus seems like he's a sincere seeker. And he says to Jesus, I've kept these commands. And you think that Jesus, the judge, would go, come on in, here's your golden ticket, you're going to Hollywood. But that's not what Jesus says to him. He says, you've kept all of the commands of God. And he says, you're close, but you don't make the cut. Sorry. And we're reading this story and we're going, who gets in? If this guy doesn't make it, who gets in? And then Jesus, the judge, he doubles down. It even gets darker. Look at Mark 12, verses 38 through 40. He says, beware of these teachers of the religious law. These are the three groups that have just come to see him. For they like to parade around in flowing robes and receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honor in the synagogues and the head table at banquets. Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property, and they pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. And because of this, they will what? Be judged more severely. They will be more severely punished, And this is kind of like Jesus' summary of the fig tree. They look good on the outside, but they're not doing and producing the fruit they were made for. And Jesus judges them. And he says they're going to be severely punished. And let's be honest, all of this judgment stuff coming from the mouth of Jesus makes us all squirm, because if you're just a little bit honest with yourself, you got to be asking yourself, is Jesus talking about me here? We all know, listen to me, we all know that we don't measure up. We don't measure up to our own judgment, much less the judgment of God's perfect Son. All of this judging makes me think of when I was a kid back in elementary school in the playground. We'd point our fingers at one another, you remember that? And it'd be, when you point your finger at me, there's three more pointing back at you. We don't like this judging stuff. Can we just be honest with one another and agree that all of this judgment stuff unsettles us? Can I get a big yes on that? Yeah. So I want to invite the band to make their way up here this morning. And I have one more story, if the band is ready. I hope they're ready. I probably went way too quick for them, but that's okay. They'll make their way up here when they get here. One more story that Mark tells that's going to help us. Now remember that the big idea is that Jesus is a different kind of judge. Jesus is a different kind of judge. And in this next story that we're going to look at, and it's the last story we're going to look at, Jesus is with his 12 disciples, and they're on the temple grounds. You have to imagine an enormous worship center. They're on the temple grounds at this place that's called the temple treasury. And they're watching people place their offerings in the offering plates. And Jesus sits one last time in his seat of judgment. Jesus is getting ready to judge what he sees. Now, look at it with me. Mark chapter 12, verses 42 through 44. Better yet, read this with me. Ready? Go. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth. This poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions, for they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on." Read that last line with me. "For they gave a tiny part of their surplus, but she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on." She gave what? Everything. Everything she had to live on. Now get the scene. Jesus is watching the crowds, and they're dropping money in the offering box. And then this poor little widow, she comes with everything she has, just a few little coins. That's all she's got. And she drops it in the offering plate. And Jesus lifts her up. Finally, somebody in this story gets judged favorably. Finally, somebody in this story gets the golden ticket. You're going to Hollywood. Finally, somebody makes the cut. But don't forget the last line. But she, poor as she is, has given everything. Everything she has to live on. And what was Jesus' point here? I have to be honest with you. For 4 decades, for 40 years, I have read this story wrong until this very week. Because here's what I have assumed all along. Jesus has said, see all these religious guys, they don't make the cut, but this poor woman makes the cut. So George, be like the poor woman. But there's a problem. I'm not like the poor woman. I don't give everything I have. I sing "I Surrender All" at our traditional service, but I don't surrender all. I've read these verses wrong for all of these years. I'm missing the bigger point, because here's what Jesus is saying. He's saying to you and to me, he says, I'm the poor woman. Here in the shadow of Golgotha's cross, where I will hang between heaven and earth, I'm the poor woman. I'm like this woman because I'm going to give everything when I'm condemned and cursed and spit upon and beaten, and I will carry my cross and I will be hung on a garbage heap outside of Jerusalem. I'm the one who gives everything. I'm going to give everything, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this because I'm a different kind of judge, because I'm the only one. Jesus says, I'm the only one who judges honestly. I'm the only one who judges fairly. And he's saying to you and me in this story, he says, nobody makes the cut. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Jesus says to us in this story, my standard is perfection, and we miss the mark. And I'm a different kind of judge because I announce the guilty verdict, but then I take the penalty. That's the kind of judge I am. And today's passage is so full of judgment, but here's what we can remember. Just 5 days later, Jesus would hang on the cross, and his eyes would lock with the very same people that we've been reading about. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and this religious guy and the disciples and the crowd and everyone in the room. And Jesus, as he would hang from the cross, he would say, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. Yes, Jesus is a different kind of judge, because he's the judge who comes down out of the judgment stand, and he takes off his robe and he takes your penalty and my penalty for my sin. You've heard the saying, judge, jury, and executioner. And Jesus in this story is saying, I'm the judge, and I'm the jury, and I'm the executed one. And Jesus is saying in this story that I'm going to take your place. As the prophet Isaiah wrote, Jesus was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our sins. And the punishment that was brought upon him brought us peace. And by his wounds, we are healed. Yes, Jesus is a different kind of judge. Because he's a judge who heals. We're healed by his sacrifice. We're healed by his grace. We're healed by his mercy. And so for us today, it's time to take ourselves off the judgment throne, or our culture, or our spouse, or our kids, or our boss. And it's time for us to enthrone Jesus as the judge, because he's a different kind of judge. Let's stand for prayer. And so, Jesus, we thank you that you're not only the judge who tells us none of us makes the cut, but you're also the judge who takes the penalty that we should have paid upon yourself. You are a righteous judge and a holy judge. And you are the one who gave his life on the cross for us. So I pray for that person here this morning, in this room or online, who, like my friend Trevor, walked into this place or tuned in online, worried that the heavens were going to crash in. But who hears today a different word, a word of mercy and a word of grace. And I pray that today that person would just simply open their heart to Jesus. I pray for a Christ follower who has been their own worst critic, whose self-talk is of bullying. And today they would hear the voice of Jesus saying, let me be your judge, because I'm a different kind of judge. Whatever it is that we need, God, would you give it to us now? Because we don't want to be like those fig trees. We want to be like you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Everybody agreeing said. Amen. So the altar is open, and if you want to come and pray, we invite you to do that. If you need somebody to pray with you, lift a hand. To our friends online, they're putting a prompt in right now. We've got a little bit of time, so you don't need to rush off. Let's worship together this morning as the worship team leads us in singing Champion.